Hello everybody, this is Maximus and I am back with another video. Um, I plan on today discussing and responding to an individual who has talked with Jim Bob. Ryan remembers someone who has popped up in the Crucible and has debated people on his, what I'd like to call, New Age emanationist view of the world, which I'll be going dot point by dot point on why it's absurd and nonsense. I've put it in a sort of a syllogistic mode. So the first point I'll be making against his view is first that he on TikTok posts videos specifically on so-called vibrations and frequencies. Well, first of all, those images on TikTok aren't real images. What do I mean by that? They're digital images. So you can't go out and find those so-called frequencies that are visual digital depictions that are used in binary codes. That's disanalogous to the claim of consciousness and energy being necessary for consciousness to be consciousness in the first place. So there's both a positive and a negative claim simultaneously being made for energy and consciousness being reducible to each other. So that's my first point. It's not legitimate. Those aren't realistic depictions. Those are digital depictions, which are not legitimate. My first point will be modal collapse. Modal collapse fallacy. Okay, what is a modal collapse fallacy? Well, usually it's representative in one characteristic. Usually when modal collapse is discussed, it's usually applied to the idea that, for instance, if you equivocate, um, creation, God having to create, and everything in God, including his will, is his own essence, including the act in particular acts that he does are necessarily applied to him, qua applied to what he is in his inner life and what he is by nature, without making the proper distinction. Therefore, creation becomes necessary and collapses in God, and God self-destructs. That's simply what modal collapse can be characterized as. The problem here is that with the idea that everything becomes reducible to one phenomenon, is that it's a phenomenon of a phenomenon itself, which is begging the questions. It's simply just a rephrasing of the claim, which has not been proven. In giving particular examples of frequencies, which are mediated between mathematics and physics, cannot collapse unless, then if it's collapsible in each other, then it's meaningless to talk about them, such as magnitude quantity. And it is a pseudoscience. So since there's a modal collapse, we can't talk about consciousness, because consciousness can no longer be distinguished between energy and power, dunamis, which, again, that's not what energy means. It's just an emanation, meaning there cannot be particular distinctions. It's all collapsible, meaning it means nothing in the first place, and there's nothing intelligible about it. Because energy just becomes knowledge, and knowledge just becomes energy. So there's a sort of monism and distinctions. As I get into my second point, collapsing immanence would into transcendence, or transcendence into immanency. Now, we can make a distinction clearly between that even when the creator. But for your claim, Ryan, is that if we're speaking of energy, and as you define it, consciousness, that includes inorganic life, correct? Like the world soul, like what Plato and the Platonists and the Neoplatonists talk about, participating in consciousness to be. To be is an adjective within consciousness itself. So there's an inflexible reduction to one mode of being in creation, which you deny there's modes of being, because it's just consciousness that is eternal and necessary. So it wouldn't be possible to talk about immanency. because immanence is one mode of transcendence, but there must be a clear ontological concrete distinction. Otherwise, we deny all ontology to begin with. Therefore, the distinction between knowing and unknowing becomes meaningless, and you can know that. God cannot transcend his own non-existence and his own existence. So if everything becomes, as you say, God is the creation, monism, then on what basis do you make discrete distinctions between those things which are not consciousness, such as myself, or myself in a particular locale, which is not reducible to the locale itself, because it's an extension, there's a mutual generation being moded or acted upon in a particular manner, which would make past events and future events unintelligible, and you can account for that, or you can know, for instance, that God had to be necessary in order for consciousness to be, or even anything relative in a set, because God wouldn't be an incontrovertible set anymore, or a superset, for instance, which you would take God to be then. In this case, that's the conclusion. Therefore, limited and cannot be self-exhaustive. What it means that for you, Ryan, is that the problem of absolute incontrovertible as the unknowable within the doctrine of self-exhaustive for God's immanence is that if God's immanence is collapsible with his transcendency, then transcendence itself becomes unknowable. Because if you collapse the two, then their mutual identity, which is complementary in both language and created order, but you don't believe the world is created and limited in the way that's correctly understood. Therefore, there cannot even be an identification for the concept itself in a metaphysical sense, in a concrete real sense. It itself couldn't be concrete and real, and therefore couldn't be known, because it's not actually distinguishable, neither conceptually, virtually, or nominally, making it impossible to know, and impossible to know whereabouts. Whereabouts becomes a nonsense, and it's not a thing anymore. My sixth point is the infinite versus finite. With the dissolution of nothingness with one reducible contradicts incoessentuality with an external immanency is not. Okay, this point, another point I'm making here is that the finite and the infinite can't be by nature the internal dialogue of consciousness and energy, as you want to say everything is frequency, right? Then you have no reason to presuppose everything is within one absolute unity or collapsible into one absolute unity, because there cannot be a relation of communication anymore. Because transcendency, as a necessary both condition and quality of the immanence becomes the transcendence simultaneously. So the act of being, consciousness itself within the created order, there's no relation to communicate the immanency in whatever modal quality you speak of, or suits your philosophy of monism, metaphysical monism, we'll call it. Therefore, to say that the creation, which you don't believe is an ex nihilo, you have to face the problem of even saying how could there be oneness within consciousness itself, within what we consider things in the cosmos as a theogony. Because the cosmos presupposes real distinctions, and to pick out universals, particulars from the universals that are irreducible to each other, such as discrete and really distinct properties from other species and genus, as if we treat transcendence as a genus or a classification within a category. No, transcendence is not a genus, because we end up reducing the transcendence as a property. Once again, there would be no property in the first place. So you can distinguish between the immanence and the transcendence, and therefore the idea that creation is a part of the eternal consciousness, the eternal emanation, the eternal ecstatic movement, right? You couldn't know that. as I've just demonstrated, because it's a contradiction. Unless you mean that the consciousness itself being God, absolute right, as you said, as a necessary attribute or property. If you say that the property is just the consciousness, then there's no absolute to begin with, because absolute in what sense would no longer be applicable. Therefore, creation cannot be coessential, because the things in the world that are at particular moments and instances of what is being acted upon and participated in, there would no longer be passivity. Now, if there's no passivity, then there's no way to predicate of objects. If there's no way to predicate of objects, then nothing actually has anything. Because if objects don't have actual distinct properties proper to it, then nothing has parts and nothing has wholes, and therefore there's neither being or non-being in this view. Because you've collapsed them all together in another created modal collapse. It's a fallacy. And therefore, it would be a disillusion between things that are and are not. Because things are now not and are simultaneously, meaning you can know or know that at the same time is a contradiction, a fat, vicious contradiction. You couldn't convert anything anymore. Reality becomes undifferentiated, an undifferentiated reality of the God within you. Hold on, how the hell would there be a God within me if the within is the undifferentiated thing? Well, it's not a thing, because you can't name it. All names are collapsible to the transcendence. But that itself presupposes that you already know that things are absolutely disillusioned and absolutely undifferentiated. So there's no room, as you said on the Discord, there's no room for relative gifts, because those are intimate relations that are communicated. But everything in the world that you speak of as energy and frequency are just activities and powers that are necessarily flowing from, but at the same time, the same thing as consciousness. Meaning there's the gift itself is just a part of the one consciousness. You can't differentiate it as concrete, neither conceptually, versely, normally, however scholastic things you want to put out. I'm not demanding you do, but in what manner are they distinct without begging the question? My ninth point, God cannot be other than himself. This is a classic non-contradiction dialectic problem in terms of metaphysics. I know you're into philosophy, bro, but you need to think about these things clearly, pedagogically. If you say that God is absolute, we agree, no problem. But in what sense is he absolute? This is where we come into the discussion. If you mean in the sense that he is himself and nothing else, that still doesn't answer the question, is that does God now not lack anything other than what he is by nature? Does that include unactualized potentialities in himself? Simply this go back to the problem of modal collapse. That is, if something by nature doesn't possess particular or unique properties proper to its nature, then consciousness itself doesn't have a nature, nor does it have a mode of being, meaning can actually operate and is self-refuting. Therefore, to say that God is only himself, to say that he's limited and no longer self-diffusive, because again, the collapsing of transcendence with immanency no longer applies, because it both violates the law of non-contradiction and it violates the ability to do anything. If this God is transcendent by identity, his immanence, then the relation is unknowable into opposition, becomes a duality. Indivisibility no longer retains its existence here and cannot be called consciousness, because consciousness is a particular mode in which something is, where something acts in particular or pertains towards a good. Therefore, to say that the absolute is also good and has these attributes, as you say, but the good must be related to or communicate towards that is relation to a good. But if it's just in itself goodness, it cannot be good, because now good cannot self-diffuse and relate to others that are good in the goodness itself, because you destroy the possibility of communication is no longer knowable. In a strict sense, it collapses itself into itself. Going back to the Hegelian problem. And you could know that, once again. The divine infusion destroys all modes of being. If you say, for instance, that creation is just consciousness and frequencies, as you say, those aren't modes of being. But creation requires modes of being to be in direction towards or before. No visible, divisible object in the creation exists without its principles. Right? This is physics and metaphysics. If you say that an object is reducible to merely consciousness, then there's no object to which the object moves towards naturally. It's telos, it's teleon in the Greek. Therefore, it doesn't have being because being is an adjective. According to Plato, if your view is correct, Ryan, then you have to face the problem that your God either splits in half and is composed of parts and therefore is mutable and now deficient of himself, as you don't call it him, because it can't relate. And therefore, it itself is not coessential nor is coalescent and is utterly confused and self destructs without being or non-being, because it becomes a dyad, as you still suffer the Parmenidean dialectic if you read Plato. Infinite, the finite. Infinite cannot be co-essential and co-eternal in coalescence with God, meaning things that are not identical with consciousness, as you call God, theos. And then creation itself is what we call in the Greek autotheos, self-existent, with the self-existence being aseity. Creation cannot be arse with God, because to be arse by what we call aseity is to exist in a mode other than things created in the philosophic scheme of things, not the theological. But you take a philosophic approach in the New Age manner, I'll grant you that. However, it still begs the question, and it leads to a modal collapse fallacy. It denies parts, proper parts, and therefore you cannot make distinctions between the future and the past as intervals. But the intervals themselves are just activities in which the temporality of things move. But according to you, there's nothing temporal, because it's necessarily eternal, and their creation becomes eternal. Again, in your view, my 13th point is coming to an end. Divisible bodies with mutual extension that have three dimensions, okay, this should be common sense. Complete, perfected, with magnitude, tilion. The other word I was using is another way of referring to an end of goodness, not merely an end in itself, as consequentialists would say. It must have magnitude, depth, dimension. Doesn't necessarily need to be physical, it can be mathematical, doesn't matter. Because in order to have dimension, because if you believe in the world, right, whether you're an empiricist or not, you still have to grant that there are continuous generations of aeons because of spontaneity. This is my other point. The world presupposes spontaneous movement between other divisible objects that have parts that have constituents. This is basic ontology 101. If something doesn't have constituents and things like accidents and parts, therefore the things that are beings in the world as adjective, as I said, you deny passivity, you also deny spontaneity. If you deny spontaneity, as Aristotle himself does, then you can't make the distinction between the past and the future. Then you end up in the problem of induction, of trying to justify time in the past and the future, how it relates to the here and the now, and therefore you as a created being, where you don't believe that you're an eternal soul, metamorphosis of soul reincarnation, right? There's no difference between you being birthed and begotten by your father's loins in your mother's womb. There's no distinction. You're no different than your soul then. You're no different than someone murdering, because it's all supreme unity of consciousness. Therefore, it doesn't. It's unintelligible and meaningless and completely fallacious. Continuous generation is spontaneity. No substance is discrete quantities and parts, so there is no here and there, as I said. Ryan remembers. So those are the points I've summed up, and I will cover some more things about your position. I hope I could kind of concisely put it all together. Um, just a bit about how things actually work in your position, right, is that you would end up in, again, I said an emanationist view, but not only an emanationist view, nothing can escape it. So the question of morality comes into play here. How would you be able to distinguish, and how would you be able to adjudicate and predicate between particular things that are good and evil or bad? How do you know something is good and something is bad by nature? And what does it mean that something is good in a particular modality than something that is not good in a particular modality? What is the quality that distinguishes between each other if natures don't exist or no have modes of being that are relational? Because again, your view of the world in consciousness, as I've already said, there's no distinction at all, and therefore you couldn't distinguish anything, including that you couldn't distinguish anything. So there's a reductio ad absurdum. So the question I've asked you is about morality, ethics, the epistemological question about how you know that in the first place, how you understand knowledge, very important, and how there are forms at all. So what form, multiform, does it take on? If you say that you pre-exist in the soul, right, well, how would that work in your view? At what moment is there conception and non-conception? Because you collapse the categories, and so therefore there couldn't be a distinction in the first place. Because if you collapse them, distinctions no longer exist. But if there's no longer existing distinctions, then if you claim that which you have on the Discord, that you pre-exist eternally in the soul, metamorphosis, reincarnation, right, pre-existence of souls, then in order to distinguish if you were some heavenly disembodied floating body somewhere in the eternal ethereal realms of consciousness, right, and you actualize and realize potentiality, that potentiality would have to be eternally actualized. And to say that there's a moment when you weren't doesn't work in your system. Because to predicate that is to say there's a real distinction. It's concrete. I didn't have a body and I didn't have a body. To say that I didn't have a body and now I have a body is, first of all, in your view, a contradiction. Because those two are mutually exclusive identifications, and therefore doesn't exist and couldn't work in your system. Not only couldn't work, it's not possible at a paradigmatic level. However you want to characterize it, you couldn't know the distinction, and distinction doesn't exist. Okay, I'll repeat myself one more time. The distinction is not only not possible, it can't be possible and is not possible. Going off your view of the world and whatever vibrations. Because according to Parmenides, which you do presuppose some of Plato's views on the world, of emanationism being consciousness, to say that the world is consciousness is first of all self-predication in terms of metaphysics and philosophy, and separation on an identity in ethereal forms. On the one hand, the fact that justice is just, beauty, beautiful, and goodness does not suggest justice, beauty, and goodness are concrete, sensible things. But will you deny sensible things? That is self-predication. But if everything is consciousness, then everything is just consciousness. To know something is just consciousness. So you end up with a problem of infinite regress, and an infinite regress can't actually give you an account of knowledge, or even to know that, because information isn't knowledge, nor is theoretical proposition or deductive reasoning knowledge, because that's just part of the single eternal cyclical process. There's not even a cyclical movement anymore. But deductive processes are cyclical because they must have a beginning and end in different modes, of course. But you can't account for different modes. So you can't know whether or not logic takes any form or not. That is self-predication, gives gives us no reason to deny that justice, beauty are separate forms numerically distinct from sensible things. Aren't you appealing to logic to just use logic? Works of Plato, Parmenides, page 361, part E in the book. But if someone first distinguishes but just as a separate forms themselves by themselves of themselves is talking about the moment ago, for example, likeness and unlikeness, multitude and oneness, rest and motion, in itself by itself, itself for its own proper being, independently of all the things. Like tochen, the one oneness. But in your view, Reinhold, and I'm reading Plato to give you some other something that I'll also take with you and everyone else reading, is that you can't speak of oneness. You can't speak of one thing because one thing is another thing. Another thing is itself another thing. So you get, again, as I said, the infinite regress problem. You can't identify something that is and is not simultaneously because you can't transcend the dialectic that you put yourself in. So in fact, your own position puts you in a dialectic, and it makes you knowing your own position absurd and reducible to absurdity and nonsense and meaningless. So your whole position collapses on itself because it's incoherent and inconsistent with its own claims, right? Internal critique, and things like the question of ethics, morality now becomes meaningless. Say the act of killing is just a part of the same consciousness, the supreme unity of being. Being an adjective, again, what calls in your view a dyad. Won't get into that. Because you couldn't speak of characteristics or likeness as idioms, because nothing has nature nor modes of being. There's nothing has modes of being. You can't speak of one moment to another, nor could you speak of particular emanations like justice and goodness, because those are just the part of the consciousness and energy. So there's no the whole, one thing in each of many. By what the large itself than large things. So God can be other than himself, right? Well, that means God has to be himself, right? But for you, if God has to be himself, and we take that to its conclusion, God is deficient because he now has to be identified with one particular quality, that being immanency. Why couldn't God, let me ask you this, why couldn't God transcend his own immanency in his own transcendency? Why does he have to be transcendent or immanent at the same time? Because you're now attributing certain particular modes of being to God, therefore he's limited in your view, as I demonstrated. But the limitation itself is just a part of the consciousness. But why does it have to be consciousness? Is it just our perception of saying that it's consciousness? Or is it because consciousness has to be necessary in order to know that it's conscious, that something is conscious, including inorganic life? Right? So inorganic life must also know that it's a part of the consciousness as well. Because you make an absolutized universal claim of bodies, but you don't believe there's bodies. You just believe there's one movement that's eternal and necessary. I'll be addressing one last point. You said that creation is not necessary. I have the screenshot. How is it not necessary? If your God actualizes all unactualized potentia to not lack or be composed of parts, indeficient, immutable, to be created, then how is it not that creation is a part of the necessary actualization of all potentiality in himself? Because all the so-called processions and activities and emanations that you speak of are just a part of the one thing called consciousness. That includes evil, by the way, because evil is a part of the necessary cause of all beings, because it's all consciousness. So that's I only have 30 minutes to record this to this recording session. I hope you enjoyed my video, and please comment, and if you want me to make more videos, I will, and I'm going to make my next video on paradoxes. So I hope you enjoyed this video, Ryan and everyone else, and See ya.